Hello, everyone. Good evening. Happy Friday night and happy Philippine Eagle Week, wherever you may be watching right now. Thank you so much for spending time with us again. This is our third and final edition for our conversation on conservation. Happy Philippine Eagle Week again. And my name is Andy. Welcome to this episode where we tackle Philippine eagle conservation challenges and discover a way forward for our national bird survival in the 21st century. This is a three-part dialogue with raptor conservation experts from the US and Australia. We will be talking to them about the different modern threats to Philippine eagles and explore practical and sound solutions. These solutions will be framed in the light of the pandemic, global climate changes, and other forecasted biodiversity threats of the new century. Conversation on Conservation Philippine Eagle Week Edition is brought to you by San Roque Power Corporation and OmniPay Incorporated, together with PLDT, Ulticon Builders Incorporated, and Energy Development Corporation, with the support of FDC Utilities Incorporated. In this third and final episode for our Philippine Eagle Week edition, Indigenous Peoples and Conservation, we will talk about the crucial role of Indigenous peoples of the world and in the Philippines in the conservation of our biodiversity and natural resources. We can draw insights and ideas from the discussion that can help us in our own conservation efforts for the Philippine eagle in our very own country. So if you have comments, if you have questions you'd like to throw in, please comment, chat with us. We are live on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. So joining me tonight is our Director for Research and Conservation, Dr. Jason Ibanez.
Hi, Andy, and a pleasant evening to everyone.
Yes.
And welcome to COC. Yeah.
Yes, COC. Ayun, meron na tayong acronym on the third episode. This is our third and final episode for Philippine Eagle Week Edition, but definitely not the last. So I hope that you guys can continue to support us, no? Kasi I think we have more in store for you in the near future for the rest of the year. It's also Philippine Environment Month, diba? So we definitely have a lot that we can talk about moving forward. So, Sir Jay, ano na? We had 2 episodes in the past couple of nights. What are your takeaways?
Well, the 2 episodes were certainly very enlightening. We've learned about, of course, we've shared about the status of our national bird, persecution, mainly due to shooting and trapping is still an issue. We had the highest rescue rate ever, 10 eagles within the pandemic period. And this definitely needs a lot of education and investments. And then we also learned about global raptors in peril with Dr. Chris McClure. We've learned about the ongoing African vulture crisis, issue of poisoning. But we also learned about very inspiring success stories regarding translocation that led to the saving of 2 species from the brink of extinction, Mauritius kestrel and California condor. And then there's also this inspiring story of the conservation of the Ridgway hawk, which is quite similar ecologically for Philippine eagle. So we're learning a lot, and these learnings are definitely can be used to save the Philippine eagle in our own backyard.
Yes. I'm actually quite excited about exploring translocation technique for the Philippine eagle. Hopefully in the near future we can do something like that, right?
Yes, and hopefully, one of our speakers, future speakers, can also talk more about that in detail. We're trying to organize another talk
Really
with
fascinating.
UK, UK
Yes,
experts, maybe.
I find it really fascinating. And also last night, parang it was shocking also for me to know na number 9 tayo ang Philippines in the whole world with the most number of raptors that are persecuted. But tama rin yung insight ni Chris na of course itong mga countries na nasa top 10, ito kasi yung mga biodiversity hotspots din, di ba? Sila rin yung kasama tayo doon na marami talagang species rich countries. So, but yun, unfortunate pa rin, di ba, to think na yun nga, maraming threatened endemic species ang Philippines.
Right, right. But it's also heartwarming to know na may ray of hope, by
Yes.
looking at more
Mm-mm.
education, by doing more community-based engagement, and perhaps
Yeah.
doing translocations as well.
That is true. I actually find it also very interesting when Chris shared with us some of the approaches that they took in terms of like how to handle the poisoning crisis in Africa. You know how they approach the people who are involved, the communities, and all of that. And perfect because tonight we will delve into that further, di ba, yung ating community engagement. So without further ado, let me introduce our first guest. Tonight we will be talking to an environmental scientist with an interest in the knowledge needed to live sustainably in the tropics. Educated at the Australian National University and James Cook University, he has spent the past 40 years in the Australian tropics, initially in private enterprise and government. He joined Charles Darwin University in 2004 as professor of tropical knowledge, was director of the School for Environmental Research from 2007 to 2010, and more recently as professor of conservation and sustainable livelihoods. He is recognized nationally and internationally for research on conservation management, particularly of threatened species, and is currently one of the leaders of Australia's National Environment Science Program's Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and an elected councillor for birds with the Convention on Migratory Species. He also works extensively on issues related to Indigenous livelihoods, particularly where they relate to land and sea management. So, Sir Jay, let's welcome, joining us live from Darwin, Australia, Professor Stephen Garnett of Charles Darwin University.
Hello, Andy. Hello, Jason. Great to be
Hi,
part of
Stephen.
what do you call it? The COC?
COC.
It says
COC.
COC, yes.
Put a hashtag on it. Conversation on conservation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Professor Garnett. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
And another important perspective we are happy to bring into this conversation is from one of the PEF's longtime conservation partner, Forest Foundation Philippines. Our guest has more than 15 years of experience in environmental advocacy and policy development. He previously served as Development Assistant Specialist of the Office of Energy and Environment of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, Philippines, and Executive Director of Environmental Legal Assistance Center. He obtained his Juris Doctor degree from the Ateneo de Manila University. Joining us in tonight's conversation is Attorney Jose Andres Ongi Canivel. Hello, Attorney Ongi. Thank
Hello,
you
Attorney
for
Ongi.
joining
Welcome.
us.
Yep. Good evening, Andy and Jason, and hi, Professor Garnett. I'm
Hi,
glad
Andy.
to be joining this conversation on conversations, especially because we're celebrating the Philippine Eagle
Philippine
Week.
Eagle Week,
Yeah.
yes.
So
Happy
Yes.
Philippine Eagle Week to
Yeah,
you
I'm-
all and Philippine Environment Month as well.
Yes, I'm
Yeah,
honored
it's
to
in-
be here.
We're very happy to have you, Attorney Ongi, and of course, my former supervisor, Professor Stephen Garnett. And so, yeah, welcome to COC, Conversation on Conservation. And without further delay, let us dive into our conversation. Yesterday, Andy and I, together with Chris McClure of the Peregrine Fund, discussed the status of raptors of the world and looked at what conservation measures are being done to address these threats. In this conversation with you, we would like to explore solutions and discuss how Indigenous peoples could help save our imperiled nature. Stephen, you and your colleagues published a paper in Nature Research entitled A Spatial Overview of the Global Importance of Indigenous Lands for Conservation. Could you tell us briefly about what the paper is about and what are your findings?
Sure. Well, I started back in 2013. I was asked to run a seminar on the role of Indigenous people in conservation around the world. And I thought, oh, well, we'll find out what proportion of the world looked after by Indigenous people. And I discovered there was nothing. There was a huge gap. No one had looked at this at the global level. So I thought that won't be difficult to do. 5 years later, I discovered it wasn't quite so easy. But what we did, we went to public source information around the world to look various maps. And what we found was that nearly a quarter of the Earth, of the terrestrial surface of the Earth, is under some form of indigenous management, or there are still links to indigenous people, which is far more than we thought.
Wow.
Of course, there's lots of uncertainty around that. It could well be more than that. There are lots of places where there just isn't the mapping. But it includes 40% of the protected areas around the world, and about the same amount of the least modified parts of the world. So the sort of places where Philippine eagles might live, or their equivalents in other parts of the world. Quite astonishing. Philippines was actually, when we came to look at the Philippines, we found that we're impressed by the level of knowledge about the sort of mapping and the acknowledgement of indigenous people within Philippine law. So many places around the world, that's not the case. So in many ways, the laws you have in the Philippines are really quite powerful compared to so many other parts of the world. Enforcement's always another matter, but even so, at least you got the framework there for indigenous work. So those are our main findings, and they've been used in various settings around the world to promote the necessity of involving indigenous people in conservation. Unless they're part of the conversation, part of the activity on conservation around the world, then we won't get anywhere. They have such. We're so fortunate that they have retained their linkages to their countries around the world.
Well, that's really great to know, Stephen. Especially that the paper is being used as a basis for policy. And you mentioned earlier about the Philippine law on indigenous peoples. And for the benefit of our viewers, this is essentially the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of the Philippines. And indeed, it has become one of the powerful tools of our indigenous peoples to claiming their rights over their lands and also over their knowledge. Just quickly, Stephen, you mentioned that in some other places there's actually maybe the absence of laws or very little recognition of indigenous peoples. Can you maybe share some findings in your paper of these places?
Well, there are places where the definition of who is indigenous is very complicated in places like Africa, where you've got layer after layer of people coming over country there. And then there's many places there are no indigenous rights acknowledged. The places where they don't recognize indigenous people, people recognize themselves as indigenous, but the state doesn't acknowledge that at all. So it's and then in other places, even though rights are recognized, there is persecution of indigenous people. Often one of the parts of recognition of indigenous people is that they are a minority in their own country. There's been colonization; they've lost their rights. They're trying to hang on to those rights and are deeply disadvantaged in that.
Yeah, so it's really comforting that in the Philippines, relatively indigenous people's rights are active and vibrant. But I'm thinking, Stephen, from your own perspective, what do you think are the top three priorities, for governments and conservationists in order to encourage more IP participation, this time in conservation?
Well, the first step is respect for indigenous people. I mean, it's saying that the indigenous. Well, I'll just go back a little bit. I think what indigenous people have to bring to us, the whole world, is this holistic view of the world, that we are not. You can't separate conservation environment from everything else that is around us, and that's for indigenous people to have had a viable society for in this country. It's still, I mean, 70,000 years. They have been living alongside an environment. They have a balance, have had a balance with that environment, and then they have a philosophy that has grown out of that. And it is that which we need to bring into our society now quickly before it's too late, given the trends that we've gone beyond with our technology. So it is a respect for that worldview. It is bringing Indigenous people into the conversation at the very start of any sort of planning for conservation. You can't come in and say, we think your country's perfect, let's help you preserve it. No, it's not that. It's got to be Indigenous people saying, we would like to do this, and respecting their rights to make that decision and decide what is valuable. Conservation is not necessarily the central part of what they aspire to. Fortunately for us who want conservation, it has often been that way. But it's got to be their decision. I can see you nodding, Ongi. There's that side of it. But Indigenous people can't think about conservation unless they have the basics of life, unless they have a viable livelihood, unless they have a future for their children, and they have food, they have shelter, they have rights to their land. There's a whole lot of basic needs before you can think about conservation. It's support for Indigenous people to make their own decisions, be part of the planning process, and then conservation can come on.
Well, we could not agree more, Stephen. No? As you can see, Attorney Ongi is also nodding. Yes,
the entire time.
Yeah, the entire time, and also Andy, I'm sure. So, so indeed, most natural areas are communal lands of Indigenous peoples, and the same is true in the Philippines, where more than 80% of natural forests are within actually ancestral domain. Now, at this juncture, let me turn to Attorney Ongi and ask his thoughts. Now, Attorney Ongi, what do you think are the implications of Stephen's research and insights to Indigenous people's engagement in conservation here in the Philippines? Do you think the Philippines has already reached that point where IP engagement is fully explored and maximized?
Well, I think we haven't reached that level where we truly and as Professor Garnett says, it respectfully considers Indigenous people's rights. We've started along that journey where, because of the legal framework that we have in the Philippines, we've consulted them. We've asked them what their development plans are, what their development needs are, what their conservation needs are. But I don't think we've really reached that level yet. Potentially we're also guilty of that, where we come into an area, we work with partners, and these partners say, hey, we want to conserve the area because it's forested, because it's a watershed area, and it serves a purpose, an ecological service for us. But more often in the design of the project, Indigenous people's participation often come, after we've thought of, hey, we need this watershed. Hey, this watershed provides water to Metro Manila. And now maybe, hey, we ask the stakeholders. So I listening to Professor Garnett's points earlier, I couldn't agree more, and I like two of his points, I like all of his statements, but I like two of his points in particular. One, that, Indigenous peoples don't think of conservation the way we do, that it's, it's sort of isolated or a separate practice. I have to agree that they practice a lifestyle, a way of living that, fortunately for us, who like intact forests lends itself to conservation of forests. So that's a great thing to say. And also, I think it's important to note that while we have to involve communities, we have to provide adequate support and provision to do so. Again, speaking from some of our projects, we've also envisioned conservation projects, but I think that's the element that often isn't well thought of. How can we involve indigenous peoples, not just in the planning, not just in the implementation, but also provide for their own sustenance, their own economic needs, and their own life and culture. So I find Professor Garnett's points, very, very true based on our experience, and also very affirming in terms of some of the projects that Philippine Eagle and the foundation have worked on. So those are my couple of cents worth, Andy and Jason.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Attorney Ongi. Personally, I also find it an eye opener to hear these things. I mean, I'm not directly involved in this initiative in our organization, but I learn a few things as we go along. And I really appreciate the emphasis on giving these communities their right to make their decision. That's one. And of course, the respect in the process. Yes, Professor Stephen?
I was going to give a plug to the Philippine Eagle Foundation because, in this respect, because Jason came to me. When did you come to Australia, Jason? 2000 and no,
2010.
2010 was it?
11 years ago.
Anyway,
11 years
came
ago.
over to Australia to do a scholarship, and he said he was going to do it on Philippine eagles. And I thought, oh, lovely bird. It would be about biology of eagles. And we sat down and worked on his proposal, and he changed it completely. He said, I don't want to work on the eagles themselves. I want to work on Indigenous people planning. And he produced one of the finest PhDs I've had the privilege of supervising. A natural philosophy is our Jason. And he is, it's a PhD is a doctor of philosophy. And it suits him so well because he had thought so deeply about this. And I'm going to make you embarrassed, but anyway, that PhD on the part of your shoulder was so well deserved. And and so the approach that the Philippine Eagles Foundation is taking with Indigenous people is exactly what is needed. And I just wanted to put in that plug for you. But it's so well deserved.
Thank you for the very kind words, Stephen. I couldn't have completed it without your guidance. Thank you so much.
Tell us more about, stories on that, Stephen, later. But yes, it's also reassuring for us to know that, hearing from you that we're on the right direction because, of course, we acknowledge the challenge there coming into a community and with all our biases and assumptions. And so we're learning as we go. So I wanted to ask Attorney Ongi, as the Forest Foundation Philippines is one, if not the largest nonprofit nature conservation donor here in our country, and is Indigenous people's engagement a big target for your grants? And if yes, how does FFP ensure access by the Indigenous peoples to these grant opportunities?
Yeah. Well, first, I'd like to just to be clear that we aren't the largest grant-making organization in the Philippines. We think that we're doing our share, and I have to confess, we'd love to do more. It's whatever amount that we're putting out for conservation, I believe, isn't enough. Now, in terms of supporting Indigenous peoples, we don't have a specific window for Indigenous people's grant making. But because we approach our conservation work on a landscape level, we believe we've been able to adequately provide support for activities that cater to Indigenous people's needs, Indigenous people's aspirations, and support, a wide array of what they want to do in ancestral domains and ancestral lands. So, for example, in the past, we've been able to support grants that enable indigenous peoples to claim tenure, to improve their ancestral domain management plans, to protect ancestral domains consistent with indigenous peoples' practices, and also have livelihoods that are consistent with their own not just culture but also economic aspirations. Um, but and it's also we've been able to do that very broadly, but I think we would be able to do more if more of our partners actually involve indigenous peoples in the thinking, in the design, and also
Yes.
in the implementation and monitoring of these conservation projects.
Right.
As I mentioned earlier, we've been fortunate to have the Philippine Eagle Foundation, for example, been partners for quite some time, and they've led us on this journey of, for us, we're focused on conservation. On paper, we're conserving forests. Or with the Philippine eagle, we're conserving the habitat of the Philippine eagle. But in reality, we're actually working with communities, we're working with forest guards, we're strengthening indigenous cultural systems, we're strengthening ancestral domain management. And when you were talking about how different the thinking of the Philippine eagle is in terms of pursuing habitat conservation, I also couldn't agree more. When they gave us their proposal, when I was new to the foundation, I was thinking, oh, so we'd probably have proposals on caring for the eagle, or doing this with the eagle in mind. But lo and behold, when they came to us for our work, it was working with local forest guards. It was establishing livelihoods. So I think we've learned from that, and we now understand more that you want to conserve forests. It's actually less about taking care of the trees or restoring trees, and it's more about working with indigenous peoples, working through their culture, and working with their interests in mind as well.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind
No,
words,
that's true. That's all true.
Attorney
Yeah.
Ongi. Yes, and well,
Yeah.
practically again, it affirms that we're in the right direction. And if I may share, of course, these methods of the Philippine Eagle Foundation is also inspired by a lot of best practices that we've learned across the years, and as you well said, we're very much, of course, motivated to save the Philippine eagle, but of course, saving that would also mean, working with their human neighbors as well. And at this juncture, I think it's obvious that one of the best practices, that we've learned and we've used as a sort of baseline and model for our work is the Caring for Country program of Australia. And now I want to go back to Stephen. I think this is where it all started also. Stephen, Australia is known for engaging Indigenous or Aboriginal communities through its Caring for Country program and also its Ranger program. Can you tell us more about these programs? You've worked with a lot of Aboriginal groups. Could you tell us more about this program and what tangible benefits did it bring to the Aboriginal communities?
Sure. Well, it started several decades ago. Two things happened several decades. One was the movement towards the creation of indigenous protected areas where people could practice conservation in the way that they felt was appropriate. But integral to that was the idea that people were getting paid to be working on their traditional country, so that they had a livelihood from there and management. And a lot of the work they're being paid to do was to control or to manage the problems that the sort of the colonial settler society had brought in. There were weeds, there were feral animals, there were fire regimes that were very damaging. So there was a natural justice in that, in people being paid to do this work. And it proved enormously popular and has been rolled out across the country now. There are ranger groups all over Australia. It has become one of the major forms of employment of Indigenous people in Australia. Employment. It really is an influential movement within this country. And it's had a lot. Why people are so enthusiastic about it, about funding it, is the flow-on benefits to Aboriginal society. It provides a stable and a long-term form of employment, but the health benefits have been enormous, and that's partly because it's enabled the people to get back onto their traditional country. Just being a lot of them have been separated from country for a long time. Coming back onto country to which they have a connection has improves well-being, but through this physical and psychological benefits from being there. So that's a huge benefit. People are wanting to become involved in education much more than before. There's greater social harmony from being back on country. So there's all sorts of flow-on benefits. And the beautiful thing is, in the last 15 years or so, some of the payment for this has come out of the carbon economy. So people have been able to generate an income from the way they manage their country, has had reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. This in turn has been up on the market, so that they've been able to bring in large amounts of money often from country that hadn't been developed because the sort of settler society couldn't see how to make money out of it. And now the carbon economies come in, and then that is then supporting people to expand the ranger program and get away from state funding, get away from money coming from elsewhere. So they have even greater control over how they manage their country. So it's been a hugely successful program.
So in this sense, Stephen, supporting Indigenous peoples not only lead to clear conservation outcomes, but also the Indigenous peoples are also making their lives better by managing the resources naturally within their ancestral domain. Well, to our viewers, I would just like to share that Stephen joined me in the Philippines and visited some of our sites on Mindanao in 2011. And that was when I was doing my field work in 8 communities. With what you know about the Philippines, Stephen, and your experiences during that visit, what do you think particularly stood out as our Indigenous people's role in conservation, particularly in conserving the Philippine eagle?
I mean, there's a lot in common with Indigenous worldviews around the world. So that was, what do I say? I mean, I've got to start with the hospitality. That's such a splendid place to come to. I love that. It was. We had a wonderful time. It was a very small child. My wife, Kirsten, and I don't know whether the 10-week-old baby's going to come into it.
Oh,
We went around.
Oh, so cute.
So that's Christopher.
I was wanting to take Christopher's hat.
Oh my.
So
It's adorable.
we visited lots of places. We went over to the east coast of them, and then we went up with you into the hills, Jason, and you got the same sort of there's this the conversations we're having were people who had cared deeply about their country and how to look after it, and the sorts of, and I love the way the conversations that we were having. It was much less about the eagle, even though it's funny, than about looking after it. and yeah, going to different. The story was the same. And what I particularly liked was when we held those communal meetings, and it wasn't just, we weren't just talking to the leaders, we're talking to the whole community. Everybody was having their say in how to plan for their future. And I was really optimistic and encouraged by it.
Yeah, it was indeed a treasured memory, Stephen. And whenever I go back to the communities, we still talk about you and Christopher.
After all these years.
Your 10 week, he was still 10-week old then. And if you remember, the leaders were he's
10 years now.
10
years old.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, young boy. And there was even a one of the groups were very worried when we went into the forest because they were worried that the spirits would take away Christopher's soul. So we had to do a ritual to protect him. So again, that's their worldview.
Well,
and we
were more worried that some of the, if you had that photo before, there all these ladies looking at Christopher, and we were more worried he'd get carried off by one of them.
take them as their own. Yeah. Indeed. Happy times, happy memories.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for those memories and insights, Stephen. I think Andy would want to maybe raise the next question to Attorney Ongi. Andy?
Yes. So now moving back to you, Attorney Ongi, what do you think are the exciting prospects for IP engagement and conservation here in the country, including future grant opportunities that FFP has for Indigenous peoples?
Yeah. Well, first I'd like to start with something that Jason and Sir Dennis and I have actually been going back and forth on, which is very similar to what, or very, I suppose, inspired by the Ranger program of Australia, where we're trying to have a conservation program in partnership with Indigenous peoples over a definite area where the eagles and it's an eagle habitat. I think we're still trying to get the foundation's minds around that. We're trying to understand it better because the foundation doesn't necessarily have the metrics for understanding what the role of Indigenous peoples are and what they bring to the table. But we're certainly open to that concept. And in fact, that was earlier I asked if I could ask Professor Garnett some questions, and it's actually been asked. Can you talk a little bit about the Ranger program? And he's shared about it. And so I think this is another of my take-home points out of this conversation this evening. That properly equipped, well-designed programs with enough support, and you can really have Indigenous peoples as partners. So I think that's one of the low-hanging fruits for the foundation. We've been trying to work this out with the Philippine Eagle Foundation, and I continue to beg for their indulgence as we try to understand what this proposal is all about. But now I begin to understand, exactly what the elements are. Why do we need this? Why do we need to bring in Indigenous peoples, and what sort of support Indigenous peoples need so that they can continue this conservation effort together with us. Other grant opportunities with the foundation include support for Indigenous community conserved areas, or ICCAs. We've been able to support this in the past, and we are still open to supporting this, particularly if you look at the remaining forest and forest landscapes in the Philippines. The big ones all have Indigenous peoples living within them. So when you talk about Sierra Madre, then you have this entire length of Luzon, and what remains of the forests are actually, as your research shows, indigenous peoples conserved areas. The same with Palawan, the long corridor that stretches from northern Palawan all the way down to southern Palawan. It also, fortuitously for us in conservation, these are also ancestral domains. And of course in Mindanao, northern Mindanao, those are all indigenous areas. And so for those broad forested landscapes, we're open to proposals that are forest conservation in objective, but I think now more embracing of indigenous people's aspirations, indigenous people's plans. And I have to agree with Professor Garnett, that it isn't, they may not be calling it conservation, but they may be
Yes,
calling it
yes.
differently. They may be calling it management of our domain, but it actually is. If you look at it on our traditional lenses, it's conservation. So that's one. I think we're open to that. The second grant opportunity that I'm also would also like to share tonight is that we're now opening a lot more in terms of support for livelihoods, enterprises, and these include community level enterprises and livelihoods. I think one of the few benefits that the pandemic has wrought on the Philippines, very few, but one of the few ones is that there's a broader and a bigger understanding and demand for native products. There's a big demand, for example, for locally grown root crops. Now there's a big demand even for coconut oil, because we were unable to access markets probably, or they had a difficult time importing or exporting it. We've now had, for example, a bumper demand for coffee, for locally grown coffee from Bukidnon. So I think these are opportunities for indigenous peoples, communities who grow coffee, excellent coffee in Bukidnon, for example, who've gone into cacao and abaca. These quote unquote traditional agroforestry outputs of indigenous communities now are becoming more mainstream, becoming more in demand. And I think this is also an opportunity for indigenous peoples, communities, and their partners to come and develop proposals that can build on these product lines or these resources and make them available to a broader market with a better price point as well. I think for us, we've always been open to partnering with indigenous peoples. We find that working with them, partnering with them, brings a different level of sustainability. In a lot of projects, when you often always have to sort of build in sustainability and force it upon partners. You look for, hey, where's the local government unit resolution that that enforces this conservation agreement or this conservation plan? Where's what have we gained in terms of changes in attitude or changes in understanding of the value of forests or of nature? But when you work with indigenous peoples groups, and I think this is what Jason and the rest of the Philippine Eagle have stumbled upon, is that they already have this. You don't have to look for or force it upon them. You don't have to ask them, hey, provide us with a means of verification that this will be sustainable, because it's part of their culture. It's their way of life. And they can easily point to, look, we have traditionally been taking care of these. This is part of the way we do things. Sustainability built in and woven in indigenous societies and cultures. So I think that's for us. We'd love to work with them, and it's And if we are unable to, it's more about the foundation and us not understanding what they want to do, rather than them, indigenous peoples and their partners, not knowing what to do. It's us probably not understanding
Actually,
what they want to do.
yes. Right, right. Yes.
Well, that's very reassuring, Attorney Angie. We're very happy to hear,
Mm.
prospects and promising engagements with Indigenous peoples. With, of course, Forest Foundation Philippines supporting this endeavor.
Yes.
We want to keep you longer, but I think we've almost
Actually, I just
done.
have
But I
like
guess Andy
one
would
last.
have. Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead,
But
Andy, please.
first, I wanted to just say that, it's really good to hear the silver lining in the pandemic when Attorney Ongi was talking about how it benefited our. It's true. And it actually leads me to my question. I wanted to ask both of you what you think or how you think the pandemic will impact Indigenous people's engagements, with conservation. Like, how will it shape, this how we partner with them in conserving our forests.
It's so difficult for me. So you go first. It's
Oh,
hard from
okay.
a country like Australia where we've been able to keep it at bay. So we're relying on reports from the rest of the world. Whereas I think in the Philippines it's had such a big
Mm.
effect. Right?
Mhm.
I'll go first, and also because I know Professor Garnett will be able to correct any of my errors later on, him being the expert. I think for the foundation and for many of our partners, the pandemic has underscored two things. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, that people now seem to have come into a better realization of how important it is to
Mm.
be self-sustainable, to have
Mhm.
local produce, to have access to food, to have access to
Mm.
food security and water. So these are all now important things that have sort of been forgotten. But now it's at the forefront again of everyone's attention. Coupled with this, I think, and this is across all of our sites, we've seen how in the wake of the pandemic, in the wake of all of the quarantines, the DNR
Mm.
can't go out. Nobody
Right.
is
Yes.
enforcing the laws. It's
Yeah.
communities. It's
Right.
communities, it's indigenous peoples who are now, in fact, protecting, conserving, and nurturing our forests. They're the ones, for example, last year, we received several reports of fires in protected areas. The
Mhm.
firemen couldn't go out. The DNR folks, there are friends, but they couldn't go out as well. They were quarantined. Who responded? Who were the first responders in Mount Kitanglad, for example? They were the indigenous peoples.
Mm.
These were probably partners of
Wow.
yours, Jason, in
Mm.
Mount Kitanglad. There was concern raised on the, unfortunately, no, the hunting of indigenous of wildlife,
Mm.
both in Palawan and in Mindoro. Again, the law enforcers couldn't go out. The
Yeah.
policemen were manning checkpoints. The DNR folks, they couldn't get out of their office because they were all quarantined. So who were on the forest? Who were on quote unquote checkpoints in these forests? Again, indigenous peoples groups. From our partners from Palawan, we were very pleased, pleasantly surprised to receive report that, hey, despite the pandemic, because we're in the area, we continued to tell people, stop illegal practices, stop destroying forests. So I think that's one of the big learnings the foundation has, and hopefully others have realized during this pandemic. We've sort of said, okay, we'll let communities manage forests because for some it's beneficial. It's not as expensive. They're there, but I think we forget, and our experience shows they're also the most effective.
Yeah.
Uh, our areas where we had indigenous peoples partners, we had community groups as partners, they're the ones who reported zero uh, or very minimal forest impacts or forest damage up until now.
Wow.
Unfortunately, for those areas where we work in, where we've had to rely more on government or local government as partners, we haven't been as successful. So I think that's something that for the foundation is a great learning. You want to put, if you're looking for a way to invest well in terms of conservation funds, you have to invest with communities. You have to invest with indigenous peoples because it's the best use of your funds.
Right. Wow. Anything from you, Stephen? Thank you, Attorney
Well, I can
Ongi.
say that what our global analysis is showing that it varies enormously from country to country. There's different patterns in different parts of the world. In some places, indigenous people have been swept aside, but because they have had so few rights and their protections of the forest have failed. In other places, as you described, it's been quite strong. Some places there's been a lot of clearing. As soon as lockdowns come in, people have gone back to communities. They have to grow their own food. They're fairly desperate, so there has been a loss of forest. Other places, the laws seem to have held and the forest seems to have stayed. So it's encouraging to hear your stories from the Philippines. But it varies so much depending on the rights and respect for indigenous peoples and local communities.
Yeah, definitely. Because again, very similar to us, we've had some areas where they reported losses in terms of forests or an increase in poaching. And you're right. I suppose it's how intact the community is, how empowered these communities are. So I have to agree as well with Professor Garnett.
Yes, and I guess in terms of priorities, maybe in places where the pandemic has a great impact to livelihoods among indigenous peoples, and if these areas are critical areas of biodiversity, we think that this is also a good a place where we could support, do more investment, so that we can give them the capital, the resources they need to protect their ancestral domain. Yeah, so indeed, this is a very enlightening and very rich conversation. We're very thankful that you joined us, Attorney Ongi, Professor Stephen. We would want to keep you, but again, of course, you have other stuff to do. But again, we truly appreciate this, and we hope to have you again, in our future.
Yes, please.
COCs. Yes.
Well, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you very much.
So much.
Same here. Same here. It's been an honor and a pleasure. And and please tell me when Professor Garnett is coming to the Philippines. I'd love to have a long chat with him on how to improve our own conservation work.
We'll bring him over. Attorney Ongi.
Definitely.
We'll make a way to bring him over.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Attorney Ongi, for joining us tonight.
Okay, thank you, Jason and Andy. Great seeing you.
See you again.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You too, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was very rich. Amazing. Parang medyo pinaprocess ko lahat ng mga sabi nila.
Exactly.
A lot, very eye-opening also to hear. And I'm glad it's really reassuring also to know that we're on the right direction with what we're trying to do with our community-based conservation. I think there's a lot more also for us to learn moving forward. I also wanted to say na even yung sa atin, sir, di ba, yung sa livelihood natin, ng mga initiatives, talagang apektado nitong pandemic. Kasi ang hirap talaga to access our communities, partner communities, and, bring the materials, get the products from them and sell and all of that. And of course, kasi nga, the bigger picture, priorities have changed for some people. So medyo, apektado talaga. So I hope that we can adapt and really move forward and come up with better solutions.
Yeah, it was indeed a very nice mix. You're getting the perspective, the international perspective from Stephen, and then apparently the best practices in Australia. But of course, Attorney Ongi also showed that, and also Stephen affirmed that contexts in two countries are also different.
Yes.
Stephen mentioned
Yes.
that fortunately for Australia, they were not uh, greatly
Mm-hmm.
affected by the pandemic. But here in the
Mm-hmm.
Philippines, in several places, it's a clear and present danger.
Yeah.
This is indeed a very rich conversation, and it gives
Mhm.
us more options, no, to move forward
Yes,
with the
yes.
indigenous peoples doing
And
conservation.
yeah, and I hope that, with this pandemic, it will, after all of this, it will open up more opportunities for our partner communities to really,
Mm.
be with their livelihoods and all of that. I hope that, we can help them more moving forward, and they can help us more too. I mean, it's a partnership, two-way street. Learned a lot tonight, but let me just take this opportunity to say hello to people who are watching us right now. We have Mars. Connolly is watching us all the way from New Zealand. We have Kirby, John. Hello. Happy Philippine Eagle Week. El Pablo, thank you. It's our pleasure to bring this conversation to all of you. Mark, thank you for spending your evening with us. Lalaine, Kenneth, we have Susan, Will, Joshua, Johnny, and Je. Thank you. I'm sorry, but we ran out of time to read all of your comments. Ang daming mga gusto mong share and mga questions also about Philippine Eagles. So siguro, Sir J, before we say goodbye to everybody, para lang they can understand better what we're trying to tackle tonight. Kasi syempre parang we focus more on communities, diba, and the forest. Medyo hindi, because most of the people who are commenting are asking about Philippine Eagles and nests and all of that. So I think maybe we can give them like just like tie it all together. Why we're doing community-based conservation.
Well, yes, Andy. So I think it's the fact that our national bird also shares its forest with human communities in the uplands. No, we always have this perception that our forests in the uplands are wilderness. No, they're not inhabited by people, but in reality they are. And the fact
Mm-hmm.
that more than 80% of the natural areas left in the Philippines are within ancestral domains suggests, no, that you have people roaming around it. But since they've been there since time immemorial, they have relations with nature, they have knowledge about nature, and we believe that it is this their knowledge of wildlife and the fact that it's their land would be a very good resource, no, and capital for conserving not only the eagles but the forests.
Mm-hmm.
And this is all the more important because Philippine eagles, no, they when they choose their nest site, they choose it and then they use it forever. It's an old
Mm-hmm.
ancient nesting
Yes.
site. So if we want to protect these ancient breeding sites and there are people around
Yes.
living there, the best partners are actually the human neighbors of
Yes.
your eagles. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
as has been emphasized in this conversation, we need to address the aspirations of these indigenous peoples, these
What their
human communities.
priorities are.
What are their
Yes.
priorities? What
Mm-hmm.
do they value? And look at this as avenues, to address their aspirations. At the same time, uh, provide a safe nesting territory for the birds. And these forests, the eagle homes are practically our watersheds. That's where our water needs come from. It's air sheds. No, it's carbon sanctuaries, and also
Mm-hmm.
it provides a lot of services. So again, as our slogan
Yes, I
mentions,
was just about to say that.
yeah, please do,
Hindi
Andy.
ko memorize. No, but we always
So
say sa PF, di ba, that it's inextricably linked.
yeah,
Us humans, the forest, and the eagles are all
yeah,
tied together. I mean, we can't think of one and not think of the other. We can conserve the eagles and not think of the forest or the people. So parang it
yeah.
always
Saving
has to,
eagles,
yes, they go
protecting
hand in hand,
forests,
securing our
securing our
future.
future.
So this is what it is, guys. So we really would like to invite everybody to just widen your thinking and understanding of what we're trying to do in conserving the Philippine eagle. That it's not just the center, yung captive breeding. It's really more bigger than that. It's really about conserving our forests and working with our indigenous peoples communities who are there. And so thank you again for everybody who joined us tonight. And Sir Jay, I hope we can do this again soon.
Yep. We've
Yeah.
invited several speakers, so looking forward
Mm.
to doing another
Mhm.
conversation, another episode
Yes.
with our
So
viewers.
please, like us on Facebook, follow us, and we will announce when the next episode will be. Again, happy Philippine Eagle Week, everybody. So just before we go, I want to thank our partners who have contributed to our Philippine Eagle Week celebration this year. Without them, this would not have been possible. Their sponsorships will benefit two of our Philippine Eagles, rescued Philippine Eagles, Agsamon and Salagbanog. Thank you very much to San Roque Power Corporation and OmniPay Incorporated for co-presenting Philippine Eagle Week with us, together with PLDT, Ulticon Builders Incorporated, and Energy Development Corporation with the support of FTC Utilities Inc. Once again, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Happy Philippine Eagle Week. Ingat po tayo and we hope to see you again soon. Bye!